Hi, and welcome back. Now that we have finished clearing our energetic pathways, getting in connection with our chakras, and having danced a bit, we are now on to our next presentation, which is incorporating the arts in delivery frameworks. And we have with us this morning Alexi and Kishon. And they will, of course, after the recorded session, they will be here live with us for the Q&A. So right now, let's go on to the recorded session.
Greetings and welcome to our presentation, Incorporating the Arts in Delivery Frameworks. I am Alexi Aline Caputo, anthropologist and interdisciplinary artist, and joining me is Kishon Monroe of the Universal Human Experience. What is climate change? A generalized answer is taken from the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, quoted as a change of climate that is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the global atmosphere and that is in addition to natural climate variability observed over a period of time. Further to this, it is described as vulnerability as a condition determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impacts of hazards. Vulnerability is also explained as the sum of social, economic, environmental, or physical factors that increase people's susceptibility to being adversely affected by a disaster event. In essence, the four main factors are physical, environmental, economic, and social. However, climate change does not just affect the climate. Climate change affects the disenfranchised in a way that, in many instances, those with power are only capable of sympathy, but never able to truly empathize. Observing the world and climate change from a gendered perspective will make you more aware of how gender intersects with other factors such as age, race, class, religion, political affiliation, education, to influence the vulnerabilities of diverse population groups, systematic social marginalization, and inequality. I was very fortunate to take part in a 12-week workshop with the nonprofit organization Catalyst Miami, which is based in Miami, Florida. Catalyst Miami facilitated this 12-week workshop, the title of which was CLEAR, which stands for Community Leadership on the Environment, Advocacy, and Resilience. And Catalyst Miami partnered with several of the institutes that you see here, many of which I've had an opportunity to affiliate myself with in an academic or creative capacity. It was here in this 12-week workshop that I got an extensive overview of precisely what climate change is and the variations of its impacts. A few of which are the details, specificity, variation, and educational components, many of which underscored the framework and scaffolding to create new iterations of work individually and collaboratively. The workshop expanded on climate terms, atmosphere and environment, atmospheric gas composition, greenhouse gas effects, our oceans, and people of color's relationship to water, and the rate of Arctic ice melt. One of the conference themes, or questions that is, was about surviving and thriving, and specifically how we navigate, or are presently navigating and surviving and thriving around the issues of climate change. And I like to look at currency as something very different than a monetary aspect. I think that currency can also be in the form of fellowships, whether they're paid or unpaid. Currency can also be considered as an indirect or direct funding source. Currency can also be attributed to an artist's contribution to a conference or sitting on various arts, cultural, and educational panels. Artists having an opportunity to partake in various exhibitions, to engage in research, to attend or facilitate residencies and workshops, and also, most importantly, to work on expanding their interdisciplinary portfolio and also to work on interdisciplinary projects that are constructed with ongoing maintenance. Artist talks are also another part of currency. Further in this presentation, you will hear from Kashan Monroe, who is the author of The Universal Human Experience, and he will be able to explicate further on different forms of currency. A second question posed was, how are we actually engaging in the museum cultural work to survive and thrive? Circling back to the title of our presentation, which is incorporating the arts and delivery frameworks. So as an anthropologist and artist, I am engaged not only in interdisciplinary practice, but also educational aspects, which include the literary, performance, and visual arts. And I have been, as Mr. Monroe is, engaged in long-term ethnographic work. This work speaks to previous work and also new iterations. This is an ongoing contribution to the cultural work, regardless as to whether it's presented in museum and galleries or other educational institutions, but nevertheless, it is cultural work that speaks volumes, it's cultural work that is able to be presented internationally, and it's cultural work that is consistently being documented. Shifting to visual narratives, this first image that I am sharing is archived at Goddard College, and the title of the piece is Naked Ships. It is from a thesis project titled Bloodlines. It is here where I began to experiment with my work as a documentary filmmaker and also a photographer using visual anthropology and visuals as a form of visual culture with a historical context. And I use this specifically because I believe that since we're speaking about climate change, it's nearly impossible not to reference the historical context of the relationship to water with Black and Brown folk. As a result of my interest in explicating further on this body of work, I was awarded a research travel grant to attend the University of Zurich for the Arts, specifically to a symposium titled Decolonizing Art Institutions. I, however, felt that we needed to expand beyond this minimized level of understanding and focus also on how we decolonize educational institutions, where our work is being created, where sometimes we're often excluded, and we're not able to expand on our own human voice to position the work. I'm making the shift now to some of the information that was gleaned from the Catalyst Miami workshop and also subsequent fellowship. So the image that you're looking at is Miami Beach. I'm presently situated in Miami, so I'm able to speak further to the impacts of climate change, but you're looking here at Miami Beach, and you'll understand the relevance of this as I move further along. And this is an aerial view of Miami, and as you can see, Miami is flat. This is a view of I-95, Interstate 95, also US 1. The importance of this is to be able to specify the difference between east and west. Biscayne Boulevard, US 1, separates the east from the west in Miami. Miami Beach is east. When you get to the Biscayne Boulevard area, depending upon your travel, whether you're going north or south, you would end up more in areas that are of a lower socioeconomic status. I'll say that way to be more gracious. It's important to understand the division of this interstate of east to west, because Miami Beach is east, and many people who are living in Miami Beach are now navigating more inland towards the west for higher ground. Here is another image presented through Catalyst Miami and also one of the collaborating institutes, the Clio Institute. And this is an image of the water rise after Hurricane Irma in 2017, Miami Beach, again. And this is a second image of the water rise in the Brickell area of downtown Miami, again, after Hurricane Irma passed over Miami in 2017. The significance of these two images, and I'll just go back, tie into this image, which shows you the flat landscape of Miami. Moving forward, and now we see what sea level rise could cause and the influence of hurricanes and other atmospheric influences. Shifting to another image, the title of this image is Caterpillar Pretty Ugly, named as such because I use the analogy of a butterfly, which at once in its first stage obviously is a caterpillar and it shifts into something very beautiful. But I wanted to use this as a juxtaposition of the industrial use of the caterpillar, machine against man. Why is this important? Because we are now dealing with a lot of people that are shifting west inward, as I stated from the previous images. And as a result, they are now seeking higher ground in some of those very same areas that are in a lower socioeconomic status, more impoverished geographic settings. And as a result, we are now experiencing gentrification as a result of climate change. So we have here ongoing displacement of Black and Brown people, which has been historical. This image was a part of an exhibition at the National Assembly of Paris. And I could certainly say that the National Assembly of Paris was definitely a stakeholder in presenting this work in various contexts, and obviously exemplifying an appreciation for the work. Shifting to the next image, we have Colonial Currents from the interdisciplinary project Colonial Currents, Black Woman, Water, Trauma, and Baptism. The two images that you are viewing now are stills from the film. The two particular images refer to the segment of the film that is titled, Can You Drink From Our Cups? I chose these two images specifically as a good juxtaposition again. The image on the left, you see two women between palm trees. You see a water, you see the woman standing on land, and then in the foreground, you see the image of the city rising. So this is a west to east view parallel to US 1, which I shared in an earlier slide. The image on the right, the two women with their extended palms, and just above them, the extended palms from the palm tree. And I thought it was a beautiful juxtaposition, one, because you really can't, identify obviously where this image was taken. It could be in the Caribbean diaspora. It's right here in Miami. It's right in my backyard, literally. And what I liked really is that this image speaks to, and the title, of course, as well, supports the image and the question, can you drink from our cups? Can you understand our histories? Can you understand our struggles? Can we get a sense of relief? I could go on and on with questions. Many questions are generated. Every viewer is going to have a different perspective. Viewers will even create their own narrative, but I'm showing and sharing within the context that the images fall within the interdisciplinary project. This next image is an Eastern gaze, Western wait, titled as such, because we have the woman here taking a gaze towards the east, towards Miami Beach, prepared, I should say, or reflecting on the weight of the West, which is what will come from gentrification and obviously climate change as people continue to move inland. Ultimately, we'll have the continued displacement of Black and brown folks, another struggle. This next image is very, very central to the film Colonial Currents, Black Women, Water, and Trauma. And it more or less surmises or encompasses all of the interdisciplinary mediums and aspects of film, dance, poetry, and photography. But it's also a protest piece. It's a protest piece that to me is very significant given our histories with water, the Atlantic Diaries, and also the hegemonic frameworks that we have had to navigate around as people of color. Climate change is one such. This is also an excerpt of the work that was presented as a result of the fellowship that I was rewarded through Catalyst Miami, spawned by my participation in the 12-week workshop that I mentioned earlier, community leadership on the environment, advocacy, and resilience. So I consider this, again, to be a protest piece. I consider it to be a piece that is representation of arts and reparations. I consider it to be a piece that represents the water diaries again. I consider it to be a piece that can certainly speak to climate change and the ongoing displacement of Black and brown folk. And I'm making a transition now to institutional interest and stakeholders. So I've mentioned one of the primary, which is Catalyst Miami, and institutional interest and stakeholders have been international. I've listed here several institutions that have presented the work: Virginia Tech, the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill in Barbados, Medgar Evers College, the National Black Writers Conference, Barbados Community College, the National Cultural Foundation of Barbados, Zurich University of the Arts, and Goddard College, for postgraduate and residency work. I've also received invitations from Florida International University, Columbia University, New York University, Edna Manley Visual Arts College, and the University of Haiti to present the work. Circling back to currency, which I explicated on earlier, this is currency part 2. Currency I define as, and this circles into surviving and thriving. Currency for me is defined as keeping a very diligent timeline and record or traction of your work as an educator or practicing artist, being able to orient the work, partnering with educational institutions or collaborating with educational institutions, also nonprofit organizations, engaging in various forms of research, establishing key relationships, having a variety of stakeholders, being open to collaboration, certainly being able to engage in travel. Currency is also in the form of grants and fellowships, and also having affiliations or partnerships with galleries and museums, which include educational components, and also educational components for the community at large. And also, more importantly, including educational components for youth in their primary studies. Ending here, I have a list of things that have served as a blueprint for my portion of this presentation, which we will at some point circle back to. Mr. Monroe will be able to explicate on them further, and we will now make that shift. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexi. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna give our viewers a little bit of a background, as well as an introduction to my segment of this panel discussion. So for my presentation, I will focus on a few collaborative interdisciplinary projects that I've been involved in with various stakeholders, which include museums, galleries, nonprofit organizations, governmental agencies, educational institutions, as well as science institutions. So through the presentation of these works and case studies, I will demonstrate the effective methodologies that we use to grow networks, to garner further appreciation and support for the arts, and to extend the reach of museums or galleries through satellite projects, and how to increase visibility of the museum and the interest of stakeholders. So artists are creative problem solvers, I think, and we have much to contribute to the fight against the dreaded effects of climate change, whether it be through social interaction or artistic interventions or ingenuitive engineering. The works I will present are centered around cultural preservation and art intervention and are demonstrated in these case studies. Furthermore, I will present methodologies that have been successfully executed to further expand the impact and presence of museums in contemporary society. I will also speak to the role of museums in an increasingly remote and digitized world. So a little bit more background on me for context. In 2008, I embarked upon a solo multimedia expedition entitled The Universal Human Experience. And it was a fact-finding mission investigating various conflicts and resolutions that have shaped cultures of opposition. So for approximately 2 years, I backpacked throughout the Americas as a part of what I consider phase one. So through my documentation of these socio-political issues, I sought to capture the reality of a world affected by the plight of human history, while placing emphasis on the process of reconciliation. One of the major conflicts documented and investigated along the way was humankind's interaction with their respective environments and the ways in which those environments affect sociological, cultural, political, and economic interactions. With each exploration, my aim is to continue to develop and an archive that chronicles the retrieval of relegated histories of the African diaspora, especially. So at the inception of this elaborate idea, I was privileged to have institutional support from the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas. So this was around 2006, 2007, in the formative stages of this idea, which manifested into this anthropological investigation. So by way of endorsement, I was facilitated through the National Art Gallery, and they also assisted with financial support. So that institutional backing proved to be a substantial base, which fostered the participation of future stakeholders who eventually invested in my initiatives. So me crafting this project in the gallery, actually having an open door for me to walk in and have conversations with the then director, Erica James. It really helped me to lay groundwork for how to begin crafting my proposals. How do I approach the possible stakeholders, and how do I develop that audacity to go after things, go after my goals, really, and to set realistic but still goals that were not that easily achievable, but were ambitious, right? Knowing that the gallery to a certain extent had my back. So I think that is one of the key roles of the museum, is to be able to recognize individuals who have promise, who have potential, and be able to facilitate them through their endorsement to a certain degree, which will help them to foster more relationships, better relationships with future stakeholders. So the cultivation of partnerships and relationships between museums and artists are extremely important. So in this era of unprecedented natural disasters, it is most important for the museums of today to not only preserve our artifacts, but to preserve them digitally. We have seen with the unfortunate destruction of Brazil's National Museum and the devastation of parts of islands such as Dominica, St. Croix, Puerto Rico. So with these examples, we have seen examples of how quickly a nation can lose priceless and irreplaceable artifacts and lose them basically forever. So one of the key things I think that museums, especially in this day and age, need to focus on is how do we preserve our artifacts, not only preserve the actual artifacts, but how do we digitize them, not only pictures of them, not only in the 2D, but actually the 3D, the three dimensions. Because if we get hit by a strong enough hurricane, flood, or earthquake, We don't want our culture, which these artifacts pretty much represent. We don't want our culture to be lost basically forever. So the slide that is apparent on the screen that I'm sharing right now is when I first started my travels throughout the Americas. So this is a diptych, uh, which is composed of two shots that I took in Haiti shortly after Gonaive. The small town of Gonaive in Haiti was devastated by Hurricane Hannah in 2008. Sorry. So dome tents, which are on the left, which have, for me at least, become symbolic with this new term we've been all too familiar with recently, climate refugees, right? This is when I first really started seeing them appear as frequently, right? So on the right, I took photos, well, I documented charcoal vendors within the streets of Haiti, all through Haiti. And I found it interesting because uh, charcoal translated into Creole or French is carbon. So carbon, carbon emissions. I found it pretty interesting. The use of charcoal eventually leads to deforestation because obviously you have to burn trees in order to create charcoal, which leaves uh, land susceptible to floods and erosion. So here you have kind of cause and effect. You also have in this diptych the dichotomy of life and death. So you're kind of stuck in this spiral where you're doing one thing, you're engaged in deforestation in order to survive as a means of fuel, uh, but then as a means just of survival existence, right? This charcoal is how a lot of people cook. They use it for energy, for light, etc. But then that actually leads to even more disastrous effects when you do have natural disasters such as hurricanes. Even though we as persons or members of the Caribbean, we are suffering the effects of something that the entire world contributed to and arguably contributed to much more than we have, right? But we are suffering the effects in that our islands are much more susceptible to climate change conditions such as sea level rise. So I'll move on to another slide. So this slide is of a work that I created entitled A Sudden Violent Change. It was created in 2010. So this is an installation. The mediums are charcoal, raw canvas, coffee, origami, and paint. So included in the show A Sudden Violent Change at the Hub, which was a gallery in Nassau in the Bahamas. So this was a collaborative project which comprised visual artists and literary artists responding to the theme, A Sudden Violent Change. And so we responded to the theme and we also responded to each other's creative expressions. So I would work with a writer and or the writer, I would work with a writer. The writer would either respond to my visual or I as the visual artist would respond to their writing. So this was my response to the 2010 earthquake which struck Haiti. So, and then I tried to capture the plight of the Haitian once again, the struggle to exist. So my materials speak to the history of exploitation of the Caribbean, which would be, for example, slavery and indentureship, and the advent of the Industrial Revolution, which marked a significant increase in carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So I guess when you really study the history of things, even emissions, you would realize that a lot of things started in the Caribbean or were born in the Caribbean or have significant footprints in the Caribbean. So I just want to show you a few details. You'd have a better understanding of the piece. So this particular image is a documentation of me when I made another journey back into Haiti. So I've had the privilege of connecting with organizations which have facilitated further insight into investigations I chose to take up. So one of the organizations was Africa America, which is a Haitian organization. And in this image, I am documenting a quaint fishing settlement in Haiti. So we often see images or hear about Haiti as a barren landscape. So it was interesting for me to see this culture based around the sea, especially due to the fact that we often hear so many tragic stories of Haitians losing their lives on high seas, trying to escape to other lands for basically a better way of life. So here again in this diptych, I placed once again an image of charcoal vendors on the right in the street of Haiti, next to a mass burial of almost 20 or so Haitian nationals who lost their lives when the vessel they were on capsized in waters just off, well, inside the Bahamas, right? So here again is documentation of the struggle we now face, the spiral of human and environmental conflicts. So here again in Haiti, you have charcoal vendors, they're trying to survive, but they don't realize or they're in a state of desperation where, like I said, it's kind of like a downward spiral. They are contributing to the cost. How much they're contributing to climate change or global warming, that is arguable. We can't say for sure. But here on the left, you see one of the human effects, right? You have persons who are fleeing these areas because when hurricanes do hit, you see how disastrous it could be. Even earthquakes, all of these floods, all of these things are natural disasters. Climate change, where do you think about it as being induced by man or whether it's just a natural cycle, right? So it is to a certain degree cause and effect. So I just thought it was interesting to provide these two visuals side by side and the juxtaposition, like I said, once again, the dichotomy of life and death. So I want to draw focus now to this piece, which is a part of the fifth national exhibition at the National Art Gallery in the Bahamas. And the title of this exhibition was Carbon Footprint. So this happened in 2010 as well. So the show asks the question, what is your carbon footprint? So the curators, which I thought was pretty interesting, the curators mandated that participating artists review select resources such as video, documentaries, and books that they selected, right? On the topic of climate change and carbon footprints, to ensure that all artists were informed to a certain degree of the environmental realities and the issues that we were facing, and that should be tackled in the show due to the theme. So it probed artists, compelling them to examine their lives and that of the broader world, actually. So this is an example of the museum, in this case, the National Art Gallery, which is a national institution, tackling a very significant issue, surely of national and global importance. So I'm just going to show a few details of this piece once again. So not only did it ask artists for their responses, but it also brought artists together for group discussions, to engage in dialogue, which is extremely important for any art form, the dialogue aspect of it. So they engaged in dialogue about topics and methodologies that were being utilized by the exhibition's curatorial team. So it's one thing to talk about art, but it's another thing to talk about the methodologies, right? How do we speak about how did you get here? How do we deconstruct it? How do you reconstruct it? How do you speak about best practices, right? What can we improve? So for this piece, which was entitled Exodus, and this was my contribution to the exhibition, this was another installation that was composed of raw canvas, charcoal, coffee, and this time I added garments, t-shirts. So this piece entitled Exodus, once again, comprises two figures who, in a desperate act to escape, have formed their very own bodies into a vessel with the hopes of taking them to a better place on the high seas. So the high seas are implied by this thin line, black line, which was drawn on the red background. And I actually drew that line in charcoal because for me, charcoal in these pieces represents energy, but at the same time, it represents death and loss because you have to actually kill a tree in order to produce charcoal, right? So the background once again is red because the situation is very alarming, it's very immediate. So this is another detail of it. So this is a still from a video from one of my most recent projects entitled Drifter in Residence. It is probably one of the most ambitious projects I've ever been engaged in. So in 2016, just to give you a little bit of background, I started traveling to Russia, engaged in research on the relationship between the USSR and the Caribbean. I was invited by the Museum of Nonconformist Art to participate in an exhibition entitled Transpositions 2. How do we find our way to transcendental homelessness? So this theme basically asks artists to respond to how, as contemporary artists who frequently engage in artistic residencies around the world, how do we maintain a sense of home as we are continuously being uprooted seemingly? So my response was the creation of a raft entitled the RV Diaspora, or the Research Vessel Diaspora. So as a member of the Caribbean, I realized that when looking back at our history in general, we have always been seemingly drifting throughout the Atlantic, searching for a safe place or a safe space that we can call home. So I liken it to being adrift. So therefore, I created a raft. So the raft is a metaphor for the idea that I have. Can I create something by myself? Can I create a structure? Can my idea float? Can I literally float on my idea? Can it keep me alive as an artist? Is it sustainable? Is it going to take me to where I need to be? Right. So the raft is a metaphor for that. It's also a metaphor for struggle. It symbolizes ingenuity, innovation, Caribbean innovation to be more specific. So the reason I consider this as a research vessel is because much like the space shuttle, which was one of the influences on the design, I plan to use it as a research vessel for various scientific expeditions. So some of the key sponsors and supporters of this project include the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, who assisted me through facilitating me in various ways, like logistics, Steward Cove Dive Bahamas, the Port Authority Department in the Bahamas, the ULAC Museums Project, Alive, which is a telecommunications company in the Bahamas, the Museum of Nonconformist Art in St. Petersburg, Russia. It was also a part of a show, Arrivants, making exhibitions in the Caribbean. And it was also included in a few other exhibitions and other things that happened around, but so far it has gotten a lot of coverage, so to speak. It has gotten a lot of attention from different stakeholders, not only within the fine arts, but the reason why I wanted to specifically focus on this project is due to the fact that it kind of created a network, right, of various stakeholders who weren't in the fine arts field, but they actually bought into the project. And in buying into the project, they actually began to walk inside the doors of the gallery through participating with this initiative, because I am a fine artist. And when I present, I, of course, present not only within the gallery environment, but I also invite them into the gallery spaces or the museum spaces, as a matter of fact, or I create my own spaces, which can be seen as satellite projects of the gallery or the museum. So whereas you're dealing with institutions who had never had any uh, prior affiliation with museums and galleries, now because of the incentives that they would receive, whether it be publicity, whether it be something research-based, they are now walking hand in hand with museum projects, right, within the fine art realm. So I'm just going to show you a few more images. So one of the ways that I went through this project was to document almost every single phase of the project. So this is a 9-channel video installation. This is a still from a 9-channel video installation where I documented uh, from the very beginnings, where I sourced the barrels that I used to create the raft. If you look above that, I was also heavily engaged in survival training, right? Understanding the sea, rules of the sea, etc. And if you look at top center, you would see me on the raft, actually floating in the tongue of the ocean, which is basically an underwater trench, right? It's like the Grand Canyon just off of the coast of New Providence in the Bahamas. So here you see it from the very start to almost the very finish, where you see me pop in once again, this red smoke flare calling for attention for my response team or my recovery team to come and get me, right? So it all started off with a museum kind of asking me a question, and it kind of ended with me not only dealing with museums, but actually inviting other institutions to engage in a museum experience, but not only keeping that museum experience. And when I say museum experience, I mean in terms of not only preserving cultural artifacts, but in order to keep certain histories and memories alive. Okay. So that's one of the reasons why I consider this a research vessel. So I feel as though the modern day artist, uh, just like how the contemporary artist can be seen as back in the day, we would say Renaissance men or Renaissance women. Now they tend to be more entrepreneurs, right? So I also see the contemporary artists as being institutions in themselves to a certain degree. I think that there are certain, not every artist, but there are certain artists who are like mini museums, right? So how do museums identify these artists who do have the capacity to draw support from other stakeholders? How do they join hands with these various artists in order to not only strengthen these artists through the institutional uh, endorsement of these artists, right? Because it kind of works in tandem. The gallery or the museum is strengthened through these various individuals based on their network and vice versa. So some of my key takeaways would be, uh, right before I do that, I also want to mention that some of the stakeholders in this example was a book that Anthea Morrison wrote, and she's a scholar from the University of the West Indies. And so here is an image of me on the raft at the port. So I think it's very important to not only keep the conversation in certain circles, but it's good to also deal with other academics, other artists, other persons who are like-minded, right? And so once again, it's very important for the museum to do the same thing, especially in this day and age where we have been confined, right? We have been blocked from to a certain degree from being in certain spaces, especially as a mass, right? Before a time, that is what the museum and the gallery heavily relied upon, but now we have to do the opposite. We're speaking more about social distancing, okay? And I think that once again, uh, these could really lend to a stronger, I think we could redefine the museum experience actually. Uh, so one of the other opportunities I had after the actual expedition, the Drift in Residence expedition, it afforded me a place uh, as artist in resident, artist in residence aboard Schmidt Ocean Institute's research vessel Falcor. So Schmidt Ocean Institute is one of the most renowned ocean science institutes in the world. So in 2019, I was afforded an opportunity to be, like I said, artist in residence. So for about 2.5 weeks, I was aboard RV Falcor, and we traveled from Mexico to the coast, the Pacific Northwest, right? And there I was a part of the crew, uh, obviously as an artist, but I was working with marine technicians. And so this institution, one of their key goals was to use artists to really speak to a different demographic, to to speak to the science and the scientific research that was taking place on the actual vessel. And science and art has always been hand in hand, whether it be geographical expeditions or whether it be expeditions such as this one, ocean voyages, right? So here I am in their control room, engaged in reading uh, data that was taken from echo mapping of the seafloor. So this is a part of bathymetry, basically getting or creating like underwater topography, right? So here we are discovering what they call a seamount, a mountain under the ocean. A major part of this experience is, well, was me having to make what they call a ship to shore call. So each participant was required to identify a group on land, whether it be a school, whether it be an organization, it was of your choosing. And you get to identify that group. And while the ship was actually out to sea, you had to call them. So it was a live conference call. So you're in the middle of the ocean. So obviously it's very, very remote. And you're speaking to groups of persons on land. For my ship to shore call, I decided to speak to students at the University of the Bahamas who were engaged in projects based on sustainability, small island development. So that is what I did. And I thought it's pretty interesting. Like I said, for one of the most renowned uh, science institutes in the world to be so heavily focused on the visualization of science and of data, right? And of reaching persons through art and the connections or interconnections between science and the visual arts or experiential art. So after I came home, shortly after that experience on the vessel, which Mid-Ocean Institute, Dorian struck the Bahamas. So here you can see on the island of Grand Bahama, when the hurricane struck, it actually took the covers off a few of the oil containers and it blew oil into the surrounding areas. So not only did the Bahamas or the islands of the Bahamas, which were struck, basically devastated, not only was there damage from wind and water or floods, and the flood was up to 30 feet in certain areas. So there was a heavy loss of life. There was heavy damage to facilities. Uh, but yet, you have these things that you might not necessarily expect to happen, which have a much more lasting effect on the natural environment surrounding when you have oil seeping into, especially the type of rock that our islands are constructed of, which is pretty much honeycomb, right? And so I just wanted to show this because when people think about hurricanes, they usually think about rain, destruction, physical destruction, but you also have these things like oil spills, right? So it's not the Exxon Valdez, but here you still have an oil spill that you have to deal with, which was one of the effects of the hurricane. So this is just a building constructed, a home that was constructed right on the waterfront, which lost its roof, uh, as well as the outer walls. Right, so it's just a shell, and persons who lived in this area can no longer even apply for insurance because the area is too high of a risk. Like I said, certain areas were under 30 feet of water. So I wanted to end my presentation with this particular image because I started off with an image of Haiti, right? Showing you kind of like the devastation of Haiti. Uh, a few years ago, persons would be like, okay, that's an image of Haiti, right? But if I showed you this image of Abaco, which is probably one of the most economically sound islands of the Bahamas, you would never believe it. right? Uh, so because we're looking at destruction right now, it looks broken. It does not look like it has a very sound foundation, but this is where we are uh, as people, as members of the Caribbean. We are at that place right now where it can happen to almost anyone, right? And if you look at this physical environment, it has been destroyed basically in a matter of 2 days. It is being destroyed. So what is actually being described with these buildings. Not only the buildings, when you lose life, you actually have a loss of culture. Uh, if you haven't documented properly, you lose so much. And I think that that is a part, one of the key roles of the museum. Okay, so some of the key takeaways that I would say from my presentation, I would want to be that museums must digitize their collections of artifacts in 2D and 3D. Museums must foster collaborative relationships with other institutions and individual artists or groups of artists. Museums must invest more in artists or satellite projects, focus more on extending into the communities as opposed to asking persons to come in to the confined spaces of the gallery, which for some would be fearful, during this time of the pandemic. So we have to branch out into the communities and do it virtually. We have to do it through innovative means. Uh, and one of the results of this new reality is the fact that we have to engage in virtual instructions, for example, for classes, for education. So I think that museums need to embed themselves more in the curriculum for schools at various levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, definitely. And we must find innovative ways in order to do that. Museums, in that same regard, must publish not only in the traditional ways, such as text, but in other ways, like even movies, right? Uh, Museums must also have a strong presence, like I said, in the educational system in very innovative ways. And that would be the end of my presentation. And I thank you for listening. And I will hand it back over to Alexi.
Thank you, Kashan. And thank you to our viewers and participants. We will now shift to the live Q&A portion. Thank you again.
Hi and welcome back. And so we'll now have we got so much information there that there are probably so many questions. So even if you can't answer all the questions right, or you can't ask all your questions right here, be sure to note that there is a possibility on the networking. You click on networking on the platform, and you can contact Keshawn or Alexis directly. Okay. Questions, anyone?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So
Thank you.
actually, I have in the chat 2 queries already, and I will ship those queries to you, Kashan, simply because of the ask. And the first query is if you can give some examples of museums or institutions that have already began to digitize and archive, digitize their archival work. Do you know of any specific museums or institutions that are presently doing so? And if so, can you name them?
Okay, thank you for the question. What I do with my classes now, because I am assistant professor of art and art education, so I not only have to teach art virtually, but I also have to prepare student teachers to teach art virtually as well as face-to-face. So 2 of the major museums, online museums that I've been directing my students to are the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Getty Museum, simply because of the quality of their resources, their videos, their 360-degree videos, and they actually have some open source content, which allows you to access a certain section of their imagery or their resources. So students can actually download, right? Before time, it was a copyright infringement to download a lot of things. But now the times are changing, and these institutions actually seem as though they are encouraging you to interact more by allowing you to download these images. And I think that is one thing that the pandemic actually caused to happen, or it became a catalyst for that to happen a lot more quickly, right? Because the museums, the major museums, I think, felt that need to do something. I think they were more desperate to keep the public engaged, right? And they realized that something needs to happen, and it needs to happen drastically, and it needs to happen now. And it has to be a good quality. We can't be 50%, we have to be 150%. So when you go on like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you have thousands of resources. You could break them down into so many categories. You could break them down into pink, red images, drawings, photographs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they also provide lesson plans. They provide so many things, biographies. You could also sign up for certain workshops, et cetera. So those are two of the examples that I would say that I could direct you to.
Thank you for that, Kishan. And so we have a second question. I can answer part one of that, and if you will follow in kind. And the question is, can you tell us more about how you've collaborated with institutional or museum education departments through these projects to engage young people in the climate change conversation and to encourage long-term climate stewardship? So just very quickly, one of the things that I can revert back to is my experience with Catalyst Miami in the community leadership, environmental advocacy and resilience program. And that was a significant segue for me to be on the ground, navigating through the communities and speaking to individuals. And first off, just asking whether they understood fully what climate change is and how they are directly impacted by climate change. And one such experience was to be a part of a community visioning workshop where we actually canvassed the neighborhood, and we facilitated a community visioning workshop where we got people to come in and to learn more about climate change, to learn how they can become active participants in the conversations centered around climate change. And it was an intergenerational visioning workshop. So we had people from all walks of life, obviously all ages attending, and we encouraged the dialogue. Not only did we partake in the dialogue, but we were able to disseminate information so that they could leave that visioning workshop with new information. And I don't know if you'd like to chime in there, Kishan, that would be helpful. And I'm also I'd like us to be mindful of our Q&A time. We are shy of 2 minutes ending. So if you could chime in and we'll see if we have any other quick queries. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just answer right quick. Like I said, I am assistant professor of art and art education, so I make these topics a part of my lesson plans, a part of my assignments. So, for example, when I teach 2D design, it's about design, it's about concept, right? Doing things very intentionally. So not only do I teach them about the elements of art, principles of design, the rudiments, the foundation of visual arts, but I also engage that part of the brain where the visuals have to be very sound and intentional, as well as their content, right? And so after they have already responded visually, we have a very, very robust critique, discussion about what was developed, what was created. And that leads us into discussions, very contemporary discussions on these types of topics and how the visuals support, or how visuals actually lead into even longer or greater discussions, and the responsibility that the artist has, not only for their creations, but the possible interpretations that could be taken from their work, for example, when it is shared through social media. So I don't necessarily have to teach them or instruct them on climate change. They actually, through the development of even their 2D design projects, they have to do the research and they have to explain to me and the rest of the class why they chose to do certain things. And then at the end of the day, we all learn. The professor and the class learn. We learn about each other and we learn about the issues in the greater world.
Thank you for that. And I understand, I stand corrected. We actually have additional minutes for Q&A. So I invite the viewers to pose your questions. Kishan and I are here to answer. And I'm just going to reiterate the same. We are very, very happy to have respectfully shared our work today as part of our presentation. And again, we're just opening up the floor for additional questions that you may have. So I'll follow with, maybe this will prompt some queries, just asking if there's no specificity in question, if anything deeply resonated with you as the viewer, or anything that resonated with you that may possibly influence your own work, how this work, respectively, that of Mr. Monroe and myself, maybe ties into other projects that you may be familiar with, or if some of the information disseminated could quite possibly inspire any of the viewers to create work that is very much about surviving and thriving and navigating climate change. That was a mouthful of a question, but hopefully we have some responses. Okay, so none thus far. But what I will share is that I am happy to have as a colleague, Mr. Monroe. I have been incredibly inspired by his adept ability to look at work with a very, very keen eye, and also to give me a lot of constructive feedback on different angles and perspectives that I can take with my own work respectively. I think that just ties into the first question that I've asked about how the work lands and if it's resonated, and is there material that can be built upon? Is there room for the dialogue to continue? And there is, of course, always. I don't know if you'd like to add to this, Kishan. We're not getting many queries, but.
Thank you, Alexi, especially for your kind words. Being a professor of art, one of the things I realize is we are working so virtually these days. We speak about reaching the masses, but then again, we are actually speaking about reaching the masses in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean has never really been the most financially sound, right? Now we are at a place where there are serious delays in shipping. We have energy crises a lot of times in various parts of various islands and countries. So we are speaking about how do we connect with certain demographics, but we have to also pay attention to the reality that if you don't have power, you're not connected virtually, right? So we also have to look at the reality of our infrastructure and our facilities, and that it needs to be attention even more greatly to the politicians, the persons who have the power to make certain decisions, to make certain moves. Because one thing, again, the pandemic actually brought to the forefront is the fact that education is a serious part of our society, right? It's one of those things, it's like water, you can't do without it, right? And when you start to see the degradation of society, you realize that education is a serious part of it. And we need to use, as artists, like I mentioned, my experience aboard the Falcor, the expedition ship. Education is a serious part of bringing these things not only to the awareness of the public, but also to the politicians and the policymakers who can actually write into laws, who can make these things happen, because we can scream and shout and make as much art as we want to, but then you still have to engage these people who actually can sign their name on a piece of paper and actually make it happen, right? And we can't always assume that these persons know as much as we do, or even more, because they are in a high position, right? Everybody needs education.
Thank you. So we have yet another question, and I will lead in the first part of the answer. And again, Kishan, chime in whenever you'd like to follow. And that question is, how would you recommend we integrate art in museums and intervention projects with Indigenous communities? And quite frankly, I would say the first, I suppose, initiative would be to create spaces of inclusiveness for all people. How do we do that? Because we are people who have historically not had a quote unquote seat at the table. So creating these spaces, creating the dialogue, going into the museums, decolonizing the museums and art institutions, just, you know, referencing the framework from decolonizing art institutions, going into these institutions and speaking very frankly and very clearly, and emphasizing the importance of inclusiveness, emphasizing how art can be used as a form of reparations, art can be used as a form of activism. And of course, art is education. That's one of the first and primary ways that you can initiate dialogue. And then, you know, within the institutions, you also, of course, have to think the broader community. Would you like to chime in, Kishan?
Yeah, I think that the museum, what they could do is, for so long we have been indoctrinated with other people's truths. I think what the museum could start to do is start to tell us about our own truth, right? We've learned everybody else's history, and you're speaking about indigenous cultures. Teach me about my history, teach me about my culture. That is something that we definitely do not know a lot about, right? And there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done. Something as simple as the indigenous names that were given to our spaces, right? To our cultures. Are the indigenous people really dead, right? That's another question. Where are our real roots? You know, there are so many misconceptions. We've been miseducated in so many different ways that I think that we have to kind of unravel this ball of yarn that has been like thrown around for centuries, right? And we have to reclaim our culture. And you can see the trend already happening, starting to happen around the world, where they're sending back artifacts that were taken from various cultures, indigenous cultures, right? And so in the Caribbean especially, we see Columbus, statues of Columbus coming down every day in different places around the world. So it is a space of time of great transition. And I think that we could use this opportunity to really, because the public is already stimulated, right? You don't very often receive these moments to capitalize on the energy that has already been created. So I think that the museum has a great opportunity to harness that energy and direct it or redirect it. So a lot of times you have misdirected energy. And I think it is a great opportunity once again to very positively and progressively educate persons on what they truly need to understand about various situations.
Thank you. And I'll end with saying, if I may, I'll end with saying to keep our sights on the sites, to keep our sights on the sites that we have not been included in, and also to penetrate those spaces with our own narratives, historical and present. In closing, I am thanking everyone for attending the presentation by Mr. Monroe and I, and that ends our Q&A session for today. Thank you again for attending the MAC conference.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexis and Kishon. Yes, let's keep our sight on the sights. Love it. And thank you so very much, both of you. And of course, for the participants, if you still feel like asking more questions or connecting with Alexis and Kishon, be sure to click on the networking menu on the left-hand side of your screen, where you can scroll through the list of all attendees and presenters and start a conversation directly with them. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you.
Indeed.
Stay tuned for the next live session. It's almost lunchtime, and our lunch plenary is entitled, "We Are What We Eat, a People Rooted in Resilience," with Peter Ivy from Reggae Chefs out of Jamaica. I'm sure you're going to love the presentation, and that starts at 12:45. So you have just about a half an hour. It's virtual, it's all virtual. Remember, to find the next sessions, you simply need to click on the sessions menu on the platform, and you see a list of all the sessions that are available. There are usually 3 concurrent sessions going on at any one time, but we'd love to have you back here in Zoom Room 3. If you have any questions, feel free to click on the chat icon, and where we'll always have someone to help you out. Looking forward. Thank you once again, Alexis and Kishon. Loved having you here with us, and see you soon at the lunch plenary.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good day.